So I'll speak in English. First of all, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very thankful for the invitation. It's been a fascinating 24 hours so far of presentations. I've learned a lot. I look forward to learning much more today and tomorrow. As Beata mentioned, I work on mid-century Polish music, and for anyone interested in that period, the Związek Kompozytorów Polskich looms very large. So it's a huge honor for me to be here and to share in this institution's continued vibrancy in the present. As you also heard, I'm obviously an outsider to Poland. I have spent a long time trying to learn Polish and to better understand Polish history. But I also acknowledge that I have a different relationship to this period and to this topic than many people in the world. So I hope that that perspective is an interesting one and a productive one for you all. So let's get started. This talk is drawn from a larger book project which I'm currently working on that focuses on the generation of composers in Poland who were born in the first decade of the 20th century. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. These figures, Roman Palester, Zofia Lisa, Tadeusz Sykwerkasen, Zygmunt Mycielskiego, and others have been studied by many Polish musicologists on whose work I build, and some of those people are in this room with us today. My book investigates the cultural aftermath of World War II in Poland. I look at the people and the projects that continued from the 1930s into the 1950s, and I asked how they were the same and how they changed across the period of the war. So I think about the war not so much as a dividing line, as a periodization, but rather the sonic event, a musical event in Polish history. So today I'm talking about the last couple chapters, or part of the last couple chapters of that book project, which focus on the period from 1944 through really the early 1950s. As you know, the general focus of much research on this first post-war decade in Poland has been on the imposition of socialist realist aesthetics, which began maybe as early as fall 1947, certainly underway by fall 1948, and really reached their peak the next year in 1949. A huge amount of ink has been spilled interpreting Polish socialist realism in both Polish and in English. I won't summarize all these publications, but suffice to say that scholars have asked how new its precepts were, how extensively its ideas were adopted, how much autonomy composers had despite political pressures, how they managed such pressures, how the history of the Polish canon, the classical repertoire was changed during this period, and how long this aesthetic, in fact, held sway. This has been an enormously productive line of thinking and inquiry. But today I want to propose a different, complementary paradigm for thinking about these early post-war years, which we might term, after the title of my talk, composition as reconstruction. Not intending to dismiss the focus on socialist realism or the prior historiography, rather suggest some new questions and new avenues which we might be able to ask about this period. And this paradigm, I think, really focuses on the role of music and musicians in reconstruction from the war. So as we know, Reconstruction was a project of mass mobilization, which occurred during a period of widespread instability, political uncertainty, and continuing violence in Poland. It demanded action from the entire population. There was, of course, the physical work of removing rubble from streets, rebuilding shattered buildings, but also the more abstract tasks of restarting institutions and restoring Polish culture. In thinking about Reconstruction, I'm especially strongly influenced by the historian Catherine Lebau. She works on architecture and urban space, who's written about how Reconstruction in Poland helped give rise to, and this is a quote, a new popular understanding of citizenship in which it was work that gave meaning to individual and collective existence. Put differently for her, participating in Reconstruction, working on its behalf, were values that helped to define community in the aftermath of the war. In addition, the broad mobilization to rebuild was one of the few genuinely popular projects that the communist authorities in Poland could undertake, a project that could win support from a population who was deeply skeptical of Soviet power. By orchestrating the rebuilding of a devastated country, communist politicians hoped to portray themselves as the sole, or at least a primary force, capable of uniting the nation and leading it in a better direction. Beyond this sort of fundamental work in Polish history, I'm also influenced by several decades of research among American and British academics into music in times of war. Here are some examples that I find to be among the most interesting lines of thought here. This work, like much musicology written in English over the last few decades, is concerned with the social function of music. These books and article have shown that music played a central role during and after conflict. It could help create a sense of cohesion among a nation, among a community. It could help mobilize individuals to action. And it could help process grief and loss in the aftermath of the war. I also draw on extensive work in Polish that highlights the damaging and in many ways unique circumstances Poland's musicians faced during this period. I'm referring not only to a robust memoir literature, but also scholarly works. Stanisław Lachikowicz's Study of Music in Occupied Kraków, which is, I think, in 1983. It's pretty old at this point, quite ahead of its time in a lot of ways, as well as the more recently published work of Katarzyny Nalewajek, all kind of highlight what was happening in Poland at this time. Because these English language works here have often focused on a very US or Western European-centered perspective, they have tended to proceed in relative ignorance about the Eastern Front of World War II and of Eastern Europe more generally. The unimaginable suffering, cultural repression usually don't figure in these, as well as the complex legacy of the fact that Eastern Europe was liberated, so to speak, by the Soviet army from German rule. So that kind of complex intersection between Soviet power and German power is not really something that's figured so far in a lot of these discussions. Yet if English-speaking scholars have shown how central the trauma of war was in post-war Western Europe, where the war was, generally speaking, less damaging, then it stands to reason that it was also a major political and musical issue in Poland, where the occupation was, by virtually any measure, far worse. So that's the kind of intellectual background with which I'm approaching today's topic. I do have a few fundamental questions which I hope to address. In what ways was music deployed in order to restore a sense of normalcy after war? What did it mean to rebuild Poland musically? And how did the new emphasis on rebuilding help to define membership in the Polish musical community? By focusing on music and reconstruction, I think we accomplish a few different tasks, or I hope we accomplish a few. First of all, to acknowledge the basic reality facing virtually everyone alive at this time. The war had imparted destructions that are really difficult to imagine from any kind of distance, and its effects are really everywhere, even if they're not always acknowledged explicitly. Secondly, it allows us to look with new, fresh eyes, I think, at the years between 1944 and 1947. So it's kind of transition period between the end of the war and the onset of socialist realism. I think these are a really important period of cultural activity and not just a backdrop to what would come later. Indeed, one of the implications of what I'll talk about today is that many of the cultural forces at play during the Stalinist era, so during 1949 and 1950s, have roots in a slightly earlier moment. Finally, thinking about Reconstruction acknowledges that this was a major way in which communist politicians and sympathizers attempted to gain legitimacy in the eyes of Polish citizens. Reconstruction allows us to analyze how Soviet power played a really central role in politics, culture, and everyday life in this period. All right. So with the time that remains today, and I'll try to both keep an eye on the clock and not speak too quickly, I want to talk about four main aspects of music and reconstruction. The first I'm going to call Reconstruction is ideology. Reconstruction was never merely a return to the status quo ante, an attempt to return Poland to the interwar years, but rather a transformation of the country in line with an imagined socialist future. Even before the war had really concluded, the PKWN's culture department declared, and I'll put all the quotes in Polish up on the board, and you can just read them for yourselves. I won't bother translating. Variations of this rhetorical equation between reconstruction and various forms of transformation, so not only odbudowa, but also przedbudowa and rozbudowa, are common throughout the musical discourse of this time. Crucially, cultural officials had begun to define reconstruction in musical terms as also entailing the popularization or dissemination of musical culture, the upowszechnienie of it. My American colleague Lisa Cooper-Vest has talked quite a bit about this term in the 1950s or 1960s, when it became a key way for avant-garde composers and their advocates to seek a kind of broader social relevance for their styles. The term's valence in the early post-war years are somewhat different. During this time, it was inevitably connected with discussions of Reconstruction. So, for example, the Ministry of Culture and Arts in 1945 wrote, as you can see this first quote, that Reconstruction depends on popularization among wide social classes. The Union of Polish Composers echoed this sentiment in the declaration of its first post-war Congress in fall 1945, which is the second quote. And then a few years later, Zofia Lisa endorsed a similar vision. She lists off the physical destruction that faced Polish musical life before suggesting that Reconstruction begins from upowszechnienie. Part of the reason why upowszechnienie could take root among Polish composers was because the idea was familiar to them, even if this specific word was rarely used in musical context prior to the war. There had been an extensive pre-war discourse focused on the musicalization of Poland in the 1920s and 30s, and the work of the Organizację Ruchu Muzycznego, or ORMUS, was an important reference point for many after 1945. Like these pre-war projects, post-war upowszechnienie entailed bringing performances of concert music to those who lived outside the major cities. Composers and musical intellectuals could not have missed the new salience that upowszechnienie lent to class, especially clear in the first quote there, an aspect that was usually absent from pre-war discussions. But for those who had been invested in interwar musicalization, the new rhetoric was often difficult to distinguish from the ideas they had long endorsed. With Stanisław Jechowicz in 1948, who had spent years leading amateur choirs prior to the war, the new slogans, seemed indistinguishable from those of the past. His entire life has been devoted to this, only we didn't call it that back then, he wrote to Lisa in 1948. Others constructed historical lineages for post-war upowszechnienie. In an article reflecting on the first post-war meeting of the Związek Kompozytorów Polski, Palester connected ORMUS and the Society for Polish Music Publishing to the ideas of Szymanowski and Grzegorz Świtelberg, whom he described as having done more for upowszechnienie than anyone else. He wrote the following. Such claims insisted on continuity in the creation of musical culture, seeking to establish familiar roots for new policies. References to interwar models were especially prominent during the two week-long conferences that were held in September 1947 and January 1948 that were devoted to music and upowszechnienie. Here, key figures from the Polish Music Publishing Society and ORMUS led discussions, including Bronisław Rutkowski and Tadeusz Orlewski. Rutkowski noted, for example, that, quote, the idea of upowszechnienie is not new, before mentioning ORMUS's thousands of pre-war concerts and how they had attempted something similar. Orlewski generally echoed these claims, and others claimed things such as all forms of upowszechnienie that we created before the war are still current. This linkage of Reconstruction after the war and upowszechnienie in the discourse of the time accomplished several ends. No doubt, for communist-aligned officials, upowszechnienie was a way of creating Polish analogs to the projects of bringing the classics to the masses that had been a core part of Soviet musical life for a couple decades. Yet for those unsympathetic to communism, the linkage also had an upside. It inserted a key issue and a key desideratum of many, the popularization of art music, into the single most important task facing the country. This is certainly not agreement or unity, but it is perhaps an awkward and somewhat tenuous common ground among different political perspectives. The second aspect I want to discuss is Reconstruction as emotion, the profound personal and emotional appeal that both the rhetoric and the project of Reconstruction could hold. I'm going to focus on Zygmunt Mycielski, and not only because we are in the school that bears his name and we're going to be visiting his estate later today, which I'm very excited for, but also because he makes such an interesting test case for the appeal of Reconstruction as an ideal. We rightly think of him as being very critical, intellectually independent, with very limited sympathy for communism or state socialism. Indeed, he was of Szlachta background. Before the war, he had celebrated the virtues of elite culture, and he had spent a considerable portion of that decade in Paris. He had a convoluted survival during the war, including quite a bit of time spent in a German labor camp. During this period, he began to write letters to his composition teacher. Sorry, he continued writing letters in a more intense manner to his composition teacher, Nadia Boulanger. These letters are a particularly valuable source for the early post-war years. As we heard from Renata Stovieco yesterday, they often have the quality of an internal dialogue. What is more, they're a relatively rare instance of a Polish composer explaining what conditions in Poland to someone who is outside of it, who didn't have much stake in the culture or politics of the day. They're very private statements. They're not very public or propagandistic in that way. These letters bristle with a sense of social obligation towards nation, one that could only be fulfilled by reconstruction. Mycielski chose to return to Poland after a brief stay in France, even though he could easily have chosen a life in Brod instead. Quote, "I should go over there," to Poland, "where my mother, my brothers, my children, all my compatriots are." Unquote. As he explained this decision to Boulanger, quote, "What awaits them now? What is happening in Central Europe?" Unquote. He departed for Poland despite his own doubts about what the future would spell, especially for descendants of the gentry like himself. Quote, "If I am deported to Siberia or elsewhere as a lustful viper of capitalism, know that nothing physical affects me. One must love life, but not fear death, neither one's own nor that of others," he wrote. His decision also foreshadowed a long-lasting confirmation of his views about musicians' social responsibility. Time and time again, he explained to his Parisian friends how Poland's decimation meant that he and his colleagues had to serve Reconstruction. In 1947, he wrote, letters in French that are translated for you in English. "You know that after I spent 5 years in the German camps, breathing open air was exhilarating. Every day I feel it more. I am happy to have returned here and to be able to live and work here. And I believe that this is truly where I belong, where all of us belong who do not fear to construct a country that has been devastated by so many cruelties, too many cruelties." Note here the slippage between reconstruction and construction in his rhetoric, of recovering from the war and building something different. It's an imperative, he implied, that is best understood as a response to, and also transcendence of the barbarism of that war. The imperative of reconstruction also led Mycielski to support, however tentatively, the communist powers that ascended in Poland. On the eve of parliamentary elections held in January 1947, he explained to Boulanger that he hoped that the Polish Workers' Party would prevail. His thinking is all the more remarkable because this is a private letter written in French, and he was under no obligation to explain his politics, much less endorse a particular side. It's a long quote. I'm going to read it because I think it's worth thinking about in detail. "Tomorrow morning, our bloc will vote at 7 a.m., so I'm spending this night writing letters before taking part in the election, which I hope will prove the government, the only one which gives guarantees of a loyal collaboration with our great Eastern ally. I've been thinking about this since 1939. It is necessary to live here to understand this even better. I hope that my compatriots, despite their inclinations towards all that is madness, will be realistic enough, after what has happened here, to admit, for once, that one cannot gauge in sentimental politics, but that only reason should dictate in this matter. A resistance like that of 1939 to 45 suffices for several centuries. If not, it's better not to think about it. The essential manner, the only one that counts, is to live, and this time at any cost. And this also demands courage, to live, to work, since we can reconstruct and construct also, and we can find the means of living in that which is given to us here." Unquote. This letter courses with a politics of pragmatism that has been fundamentally shaped by war. There is certainly an undercurrent of sarcasm, if not critique, in phrases such as our great Eastern ally, and the phrase collaboration loyale, which in the original French perhaps calls to hear a parallel between the Soviet Union and Vichy France. And he also rejects the Polish romantic tradition of hopeless yet brave resistance to foreign rule, which he calls the inclinations towards all that is madness, doubtless referring to the Warsaw Uprising, in exchange for the equal bravery he believes that is required to work within the system. The war is the at once awesome and inexplicable force of gravity behind these beliefs, which he casts as only truly comprehensible to those on the ground. While it might seem an about face for a count to endorse the Polish Workers' Party, this letter also reveals a deeper level of continuity. Notions of service and leadership, long ingrained in the intelligentsia's and gentry's self-image, remained intact here, even as the country's political leadership does not. Mycielski's hopes were borne out. The election would confirm the loyal collaboration with the Soviet Union, but only because its results were forged. Over the following years, Mycielski enacted the pragmatic compromise that he mentioned here. He served as president of the Związek Kompozytorów Polskich during the height of Stalinism, and became an important translator of socialist realist ideals into a form that would be, at the very least, palatable for Poland's composers. While he would later, by the 1960s, become a staunch critic of state socialism, he, in the early post-war years, saw it as perhaps the only viable path away from the war. I next want to talk about Reconstruction as community. If Reconstruction was becoming a way of defining belonging, then it could also become a strategy for critiquing those who seemed to fail at pulling their weight. Such critiques were, in several instances, directed to composers living abroad. As we know from the research of many people in this room, including from the brilliant volumes of Muzyka polska za granicą, prior to the war, Polish composition had been heavily international and internationalist. Contact with French music especially was seen as particularly vital. After the war, the fate of this musical internationalism was somewhat fraught. Many composers and students still traveled abroad, performed abroad. Pieces were sent to the ISCM for several years. But composers who had spent the war abroad or moved there afterwards, Roman Palester, Antoni Szałowski, Konstanty Regame, and Jerzy Fittelberg, were understandably torn between maintaining their connections to the Polish musical community and returning to Soviet-backed Poland. Some were able to strike a kind of balance. Regame, for instance, remained quite involved in discussions of Polish aesthetics in the late 1940s, despite being based in Switzerland during most of that time. But others met a harsher reaction. In 1947, Tadeusz Oleski, who was in the head of PWM, berated Palester, who had recently located to Poland, in the following terms. That this collective work in the first quote here is really referring to rebuilding the country is made even more apparent in the letter from the following year, when he basically accuses Palester of not wanting to kind of be involved, to devote himself to the work of reconstruction. This exchange does need to be understood within the context of ongoing fights about the publication of Palester's works. Palester wants PWM to take his work seriously. Oleski is under a lot of different pressures to the contrary. It's also clear how Oleski is wielding the idea of reconstruction to suggest that it's only work that's being carried out within Poland that matters. The fact that Palester is creating really important works in Paris is not particularly relevant in Oleski's views. These new boundaries were especially sharply drawn by Mycielski once again, in a letter that reflects his own changing views from a committed Francophile to a Polish-based servant of Reconstruction. In 1947, he attempted to convince Szałowski to return to Paris, writing the following. We'll note here how he equates work for reconstruction with cultural citizenship, with belonging to the community. We are here, we are not there, we are here. And suggests that Szałowski is kind of losing his place. These statements of Mycielski and Oleski can be interpreted in several ways. They certainly, I think, suggest the fraying of the long-time internationalist underpinnings of Polish composition after the war. If Warsaw lay in ruins, this logic goes, then learning about the latest compositional trends in Paris simply seems less relevant. But they also suggest that Reconstruction was a powerful rhetorical tool, one that could persuade, or at the very least shame, others to take their sides. Who could be against rebuilding? They both seem to insinuate. Now finally, I want to talk about Reconstruction as aesthetics. That is to say, musical or sonic analogs to the broader social and cultural processes I have been discussing. Centrally, I propose such compositions deploy the style of neoclassicism to insist on an imagined continuity between past and present, in ways that suggest the groundedness of the past over cataclysm. Here, the ability of the neoclassic aesthetic to enact a return to an earlier stylistic period or repertoire could suggest continuities in culture. I'm going to talk mostly about a piece by Roman Palester, but these ideas could, I think, also be productively applied to compositions by Panufnik, Bacewicz, Piechowicz, and perhaps some others as well. So let's consider Palester's 1943 composition titled Ogiński Polonezes. In this composition, he arranged polonezes by Ogiński. The work was premiered at the inaugural concert of the State Philharmonic Orchestra in Kraków in April 1945 and became a widely performed composition in this period. The direct impetus for the composition a few years earlier was a commission from the radio division of the Delegates Bureau of the Underground for popular style compositions of a national character. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given this objective, Palester rarely deviates from Ogiński's harmonic language in the composition. Instead, he primarily is working in the realm of instrumentation and orchestration, most notably by including a harpsichord, which performs a quasi-continuo part throughout. I'm going to play a bit of the opening here for you to give a sense of what this sounds like, hopefully. Oh, yeah, it works. By basing the composition on Ogiński's Polonezes, Palester evoked an earlier moment of persecution, one that Poles and Polish identity had survived. This next part is where I explain who Ogiński is for English-speaking audiences. I will try to condense that for you. Ogiński was a diplomat, and his composition came to reflect the late 18th century partitions. He's best known, perhaps, for introducing the melancholy cast to the stately genre of the Polonaise, turning it into a symbol of nostalgia for the lost nation. In turning to music that conjured this earlier history, Palester drew on established signifiers of nation. His compositional decisions further reinforced the connections between Ogiński's Polonezes and longing. Near the end of the piece, the orchestra fades into one of the thinnest and quietest textures. From this clearing, we hear the harpsichord playing the first phrase of Ogiński's most famous Polonaise, Farewell to the Fatherland. Of all the Polonaises, this one most clearly evoked a sense of both personal and national loss. Ogiński had composed it as he immigrated from Poland following the defeat of the Kościuszko uprising, and in Palester's arrangement, the harpsichord stands as a symbol for sounds of a long past era. It is as if a memory of this earlier time emerges frail and ghost-like from within this contemporary arrangement. Now, this is an archival recording. It's not played on the harpsichord, but we'll have to imagine what it is. There it goes. Palester described this work as a story about the past in an intentionally faded coloring. He thought that audiences quickly grasped that it was a wistful nod to that which will never return, as it's a nostalgia and loss. For Stefan Kisielewski, the critic and composer, writing in 1945, Palester's turn to old music presented something more of a riddle. What is this tank of modern music doing with these old-fashioned polonaises, he asked. He answered this question by claiming that the work was nothing short of living proof of Poland's national and spiritual continuity. At first glance, this might appear a rather large claim to pin on a modest arrangement of polonaises, but Kisielewski's views here were powerfully connect new music to more established beliefs about the power of culture to define the nation. Most prominently, the phrase Ark of the Covenant between the old and new years is an allusion to Konrad Wallenrod. Now I summarize what that is for English-speaking audiences, so I'll skip that for you. His allusions to these lines are especially significant because the original passage from the Mickiewicz discusses the power of song to awaken the hero to defense of his nation. In Kisielewski's view, music could ground Polish culture in a foundation that remains stable despite both historical cataclysms and the more recent trauma of World War II. Indeed, in December of 1945, he returned to that same illusion, extrapolating it now to... Right, so those are the two Kisielewski quotes on Palester. This is the one I meant to have up. Extrapolating it to national culture itself. What is interesting about Kisielewski's views are that they afford music itself a role in counteracting the war. He suggests that making and listening to music was a guarantee of permanence, of survival across trauma. Perhaps this or similar views were one of the reasons that many witnesses at the time described a flourishing of interest in concerts shortly after the war. Here's one such quote from the singer Ewa Bantowska-Twiska writing to Tradycja in 1948. So, to wrap things up, this talk has certainly not discussed everything that can or should be said about the musical aftermath of war in Poland, but I do hope it offers an invitation to look at the post-war decade in a different light. What I have been suggesting is that the aftermath of the war deserves to be seen as a key aesthetic, political, and musical problem of this period. It was fundamentally a political issue of who would lead Polish music forward and how musical culture would be transformed by this process. Reading the pages of, say, Ruch Muzyczny before its closure, one will certainly not find article after article about the war that explicitly mentions it, that talks about its consequences. But one will find an undeniable urgency to polemics and discussions, a sense that these debates about music mattered and mattered profoundly. The stakes were high, I've suggested, not only because of the large losses of the recent past, but also because Reconstruction was a unique window in which the future of musical culture could be defined and debated. Dziękuję bardzo za uwagę i zachęcam Państwa do dyskusji, do pytań, do komentarzy.
Już chyba działa. Nie działa?
Dobrze, to musimy jakoś chyba tym jednym, bo może uda mi się włączyć za chwilę. Bardzo serdecznie dziękujemy. Ja się ogromnie cieszę, że ten temat się pojawił, bo rzeczywiście coraz częściej również w swoich badaniach i pewnie wszyscy, którzy koncentrujemy się na tych powojennych pierwszych latach, wydaje mi się, że coraz lepiej widzimy właśnie tę złożoność tych pierwszych lat powojennych, również właśnie w tej kategorii emocjonalnej. I tu bardzo dziękuję za przywołanie tych listów, bo rzeczywiście korespondencja jest takim źródłem, które pokazują nam te przemyślenia, emocje w takim, no wtedy, jak to wtedy było. I te listy Mycielskiego, ale także listy Palestra do Ochlewskiego, także Palestra do Mycielskiego, znakomicie oddają ducha tamtych czasów. Pokazują również to, że właśnie ta złożoność emocji, takiej poczucia powinności bycia w kraju, odbudowywania, czy też dbania o to, co tutaj jest i co tu powinniśmy robić, również powodowała właśnie później pewne niezrozumienie, przynajmniej części środowiska, tych decyzji o emigracji, które najpierw podjął Palester, później Panównik. To nie było, oczywiście, że władze później bardzo szybko próbowały wyciąć ich z życia, ale również w środowisku często to było postrzegane jako wybór takiego łatwiejszego życia za granicą, a nie pracy tutaj z nami w Polsce na rzecz odbudowy czy budowy, przebudowy polskiej kultury. Ale to taka moja refleksja, ale nie chciałabym tutaj monopolizować dyskusji. Bardzo proszę Państwa o pytania. Marta szuka.
Ja może nie w charakterze pytania, tylko ostatnio czytałam książkę C.D. Bylander o ideologiach i tutaj zastanawiam się, czy koncepcja kompozycji jako rekonstrukcji, a nie kompozycji jednak jako kontynuacji chociażby wzorów Szymanowskiego, które były bardzo dla tego pokolenia tuż powojennego i dla tej twórczości ważne, No właściwie zabrakło mi tego, że to nie tylko była rekonstrukcja, czyli powrót do wzorców, które były, ale również oczywiście ideologicznie było to narzucone przez reżim, ale również próba kontynuacji poszukiwań modernistycznych, tak mi się wydaje. To może nie jest pytanie, ale tylko głos.
So I'll respond to this. Thank you very much for that. I think the question of continuity across the war in Poland is a fascinating one. And I think you're right that in a lot of senses, what we see here, for example, in the discussion of Ushaknienia is precisely composers of this generation saying, we're doing what we were doing before the war, or continuing that work. So I think that's right, that the idea that the war is a fundamental rupture in Polish culture needs to be approached carefully. That being said, in a way, Reconstruction also provides an opportunity for enacting those projects. It's a way of saying, we need a widespread mobilization around this project. It's a way for different objectives, projects, hopes, dreams, if you want to use that language, to find a foothold in a period where they might have been marginalized before. So also I talk about Tadeusz Olszewski and the founding of PWM. It's a great example of that. He's, before the war, involved with Ormus, with the Polish Music Publishing Society in April 1945. He's able to found PWM, so he sees that post-war institution is really continuing the work that had come before. So yeah, in general, I think it's worth focusing on we're taking seriously the kind of cultural continuities that these figures engage with. So thank you very much for that commentary.
Tak, oczywiście ten wątek rekonstrukcji, odnoszenie się do muzyki dawnej to był tylko jeden z wątków, które w tej muzyce powojennej naszej były wówczas istotne. Także to tylko też tytułem do powiedzenia pan prezes.
Ja chcę powiedzieć, że ta koncepcja tych 4 aspektów, które pan przedstawił, no bardzo sophisticated jest. Taka, trzeba by się zastanowić nad tym rzeczywiście głębiej. Ale wracając do tego, co pani Marta powiedziała o tej kontynuacji, to myślę, że te polonezy Ogińskiego opracowane. Kiedy?
W czasie wojny powstały, to nie były na fali narzucenia.
No ale komentarz Kisielewskiego był bardzo znamienny, że to smętne odniesienie do przeszłości, która nie wróci. Była świadomość, że coś się tak radykalnie zmienia, że Ogiński przestaje być aktualny jak gdyby. Że owszem, jest takie wspomnienie, chciałoby się do tej przeszłości, ale tego nie będzie. To jest taki najlepszy komentarz do tej sytuacji powojennej, chociaż to w czasie wojny było.
Tak, oczywiście i myślę, że faktycznie sytuacja się zmieniła radykalnie i myślę, że bardzo często widzimy 45 rok jako taką cezurę, która oczywiście była, natomiast i to, co podkreśla Mackenzie również, no właściwie to samo pokolenie, które było przed wojną, tworzyło życie polskie muzyczne tuż po wojnie, więc i stylistycznie również praktycznie co najmniej do socrealizmu, a właściwie nawet do awangardy, to jest przecież kontynuacja tych idei, które zapoczątkowane zostały już przed wojną. I neoklasycyzmu, i idei Szymanowskiego, i nawiązywania do folkloru, i nawiązywania do upowszechnienia. Dlatego zresztą również wprowadzenie tych nakazów politycznych padało na niezły grunt, ponieważ to wszystko były idee, które funkcjonowały, które naprawdę bardzo mocno środowisko kompozytorskie i muzyczne pasjonowały już od czasów przedwojennych. To na pewno jeszcze będzie wracało również podczas jutrzejszych paneli. Nie wiem, czy jeszcze ktoś z Państwa chciałby koniecznie zabrać głos. Małgosia?
Koniecznie, tak. Chciałam tylko powiedzieć, my oczywiście te listy czytamy, stosując jak gdyby naszą też wrażliwość. Trzeba pamiętać o tym, że jest coś takiego jak kontekst organiczny. Tutaj przemycane są też pewne, powiedziałabym, odcienie metafory, bo tu jednak Kisielewski wyraźnie pisze o tym, że ma symboliczną wymowę ojczyzna duchowa. Moje pytanie, my question is connected with reconstruction as a kind of spirituality. Not only ideology, emotion, of course, but also spirituality, and the problem of deconstruction, not only reconstruction. But I think it's a discussion not for this moment, but thank you very much.
Yeah, the phrase ojczyzna duchowa is a very curious one. I mean, I think it's worth considering Kisielewski as being one of the kind of main music critic, I think it's fair to say, in the tygodnik powszechny at this time, kind of thinking about Polishness in terms of Catholicism is something that's very important to him. So I do think you're right. There's a religious or perhaps spiritual continuity there in which he's placing the nation. It's also, I think, possible to simply read it as having the sense of spirit, right, of a kind of culturalness, almost a kind of neo-Herderian view of the nation being embodied in its cultural artifacts across time. So I haven't quite made up my mind about what that term means. So thank you very much for that question.